So, hello and welcome, everybody. This is the fourth webinar in our series, our Landscapes That Last webinar series that we started in December from North Carolina Sea Grant and the Coastal Landscapes Initiative. My name is Gloria Putnam. I help coordinate the initiative, and I'm on staff at North Carolina Sea Grant at NC State University. Some of you have heard me say this before, but a major focus of CLI is to bring topical experts together to create helpful resources tailored to coastal North Carolina with the intent to foster the adoption of practices that really help support our healthy landscapes in North Carolina. And we intend to do that in part with these monthly webinars that we hope to continue on the third Thursday of every month throughout 2026. We will be recording today's webinar, and actually I'm going to ask Christy if she will check to make sure we are recording it. It's supposed to automatically do it, but I didn't check beforehand. But we will share the recording with everyone when it's posted online in a few weeks. Our next webinar is scheduled for April 16th. Again, that's going to be at the lunchtime hour. And I will be joining Amy Mead at the Cooperative Extension in New Hanover County to talk about selecting and arranging native plants. And we're going to have a major focus on our Coastal Landscape Initiative design templates, which if you haven't seen, they are available on our resource page. And we'll include a link to that in just a minute if Chrissy hasn't done it. If Chrissy doesn't get to it, I will when Rachel starts talking. But registration is open, and I hope you can grab your seat pretty soon for that. I thought some of you might like to know who else is interested in this topic, so I created a slide here that shows who registered for today's event. As we pretty much expected, and we're glad to have a majority of homeowners and extension master gardeners. But as we hoped, there are also some landscape designers and some architects. We have private landscape contractor who's getting ahead of the curve here, learning about these topics a little bit more because we see an increased demand and desire to use native plants. They'll be ready to provide these services. We have some growers and a retail nursery. We also have some municipal, county, and state agency staff that have landscaping responsibilities or environmental management responsibilities. We have an elected and an appointed local official from the coast, and the all-important environmental educators. And I share this with you in part to let you know that there's a broad swath of people interested in this topic. And I want to encourage you to share our future webinar announcements with others in your coastal community, because the more we develop our shared knowledge on these topics, the easier it's going to be for us to communicate with one another, to reach our shared goals, and to also find ways together to help attain them. So today's webinar is we welcome back Rachel Veal. She was with us in January. She is the conservation horticulturist from the aquarium on Roanoke Island. Rachel has been an important and significant contributor to the Coastal Landscapes Initiative since we started back in 2007. In January, Rachel provided us a really great introduction to the topic of nature-friendly landscaping, and she's going to be digging into the subject matter a little deeper today. Joining us also today is Christy Perrin, who's a colleague of mine, and she will be reviewing the questions that you are submitting in the Q&A box, which I'll talk to you about in just a minute. And at the end of the hour is when we take most of the questions, although we may stop at one point along the way for clarification questions. Some of our other long-term CLI partners are with us also. Emily Morrison with Cooperative Extension in Onslow County, Amy Mead with Cooperative Extension in New Hanover County, Carol Peoples, who's with the North Carolina Native Plant Society Central Coastal Plain. She started that and chairs it. And also Kathy Mitchell, who is up in Dare County and with a our company called Coastal Roots Garden Design. What's really great is that we have wonderful representation from the north to the southern part of the coast, and that's important because the coast varies so much. We really appreciate them being here to help with Q&A along the way and at the end. So just one more topic that I want to touch on, and that is talking about, we do have the chat function, you found that, but we also have a Q&A box that we ask people to use to submit their questions. And the reason for that is because it's easier for us to pay attention to that particular box. So you're submitting their questions as opposed to looking for that and the chat. So use the chat to share information and potential links, maybe to make some comments, but please try to put your questions in the Q&A box. Looks like I have two of those slides for some reason. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Rachel, and she is going to talk to us for the next hour. Now let me stop my share, Rachel, get you on.
Okay, we'll get shared up here. Okay, Gloria, thumbs up. Do you see that? Do you see my screen?
I do see your screen. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay.
It's
always hard when you can't see what everyone else sees.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to minimize you. Then I'll get started. Also, while I'm doing this, I want to thank Gloria because she does all the more thankless sort of behind the scenes work to get all this organized. So we really appreciate her doing that because it's a lot of work that people don't usually see. So we'll just jump right in because there is a lot of information. I'm Rachel, and we're going to be talking about sort of how-to of nature-friendly gardening today. So the shift in the mindset from having landscapes and gardens that exist only to serve the needs of the folks that use them to spaces that also meet the needs of the animals that were there before us is relatively new in the history of modern landscaping. There's lots of information available as to how to make our managed outdoor spaces more nature-friendly, and lots more still to be discovered. More importantly, we're just figuring out the best ways to disseminate that information to a general public that may not have any gardening or ecology background, so they can be successful in creating their own eco-friendly landscapes. In this presentation, we'll build on the information we shared in January on why these concepts are important by presenting actionable advice to create eco-friendly landscapes that still meet the needs of the humans that share the space. There's a big learning curve when transitioning away from conventional practices. And learning as you go is definitely an important part of the process. We'll focus on strategies for designing nature-friendly spaces that are also realistic to maintain, noting common pitfalls that could limit your long-term success. I won't promise it's easy, especially when maintaining aesthetic standards is a factor, but it is possible and it's very rewarding. In short, in this presentation, we hope that we will help you create landscapes that are beautiful, functional, and full of life. So that it's easier to follow, here's a quick outline. We're going to start with a review and move on to design, and then end with maintenance. We'll also stop at the end of design and our insect discussion to answer questions you may have about these sections along the way. And then we'll address any other questions at the end. This presentation is densely packed with all the information I wish I'd known when I first started my horticultural journey. Hopefully this information will be a resource you can refer back to if there's more than you can absorb in one sitting. Since we've already discussed in depth the environmental importance of having nature-friendly yards and landscapes, let's start with a quick summary of the main takeaway message from January. Plant native host plants, prioritizing keystone species for your region. These are the plants doing the heavy lifting to support our ecosystems, so we want to include lots of them in our outdoor spaces. To put this into practice, here's a real-life example of choices for fall blooming perennials. Goldenrod is considered one of the best plants for wildlife of all kinds. The species pictured here happens to be a pretty aggressive spreader, but if you have a smaller yard, there are other more well-behaved species. Comparatively, double-flowered mums don't provide any resources, but at least aren't doing any harm in that they're not invasive. It's more like they're taking up space for something that could be adding life to your garden. So when we're comparing these two, the goldenrod is the better choice. If you feel a mum is necessary for fall decorating, you could choose a single flowered option that isn't meant to be disposed of after planting, so at least the nectar would be available and less resources would be wasted. So when trying to determine what are the keystone plants for your region, there's several online tools which allow you to search by zip code. You can figure out the plant genera that provide the most wildlife benefits in your region, and from there, figure out which species are best for your growing conditions. These tools are listed in your handout or can be easily found in an internet search. There's ample information on garden design, whether the gardens be native plant-based or more conventionally themed. Our focus here is to also make the design sustainable, maintainable, and nature-friendly, with a focus on trying to meet aesthetic standards of residential neighborhoods and commercial businesses. While I may disagree with some of the restrictions imposed by HOAs and city ordinances, I think we can work to amend these restrictions while at the same time continuing to implement nature-friendly practices that are acceptable to folks who may not share a passion for conservation. In design logistics, we'll start where we left off with preserving what you have. Then look how existing environmental conditions should inform plant choice. For there, we'll cover maintenance consideration and plant characteristics that will be important to think about when you design your space. I'll quickly remind everyone that often you'll have plants with high wildlife value in your yard or on your property. Keeping native plants that are already occurring can make your job a lot easier and save you money. So from here, you might think, how do I know what I have? Seek and iNaturalist are amazing free apps that are great for getting positive identifications on plants and animals. These can also be really helpful for plant ID when you're shopping at a nursery. Another resource available in some areas are a Nature at Home or similar programs that will send folks to your house to help you identify what you have, or you may be able to find someone locally who's willing to help you. The first step in design is understanding your yard. The slope will affect the amount of water available to plants, and understanding where the water goes and where the low spots are, even in a relatively flat yard, will help you choose the right place for your plants. Wind and salt exposure, both aerosol and in the water, are also important factors. Soil conditions, beyond moisture, also make a big difference. Nutrient-poor soil should be paired with plants that thrive in nutrient-poor habitats to avoid the need for costly fertilizers and other soil amendments. Lastly, understanding your light requirements and how they change seasonally will affect the health of your chosen plants. The garden being created on the bottom right seems to be in full sun, but a large pine tree on the south side of the garden blocks much of the midday sun in the spring and fall. In addition, the soil here is mostly what's considered an urban soil filled with parking lot debris, so it's not going to provide a lot in the way of soil fertility. The bottom line is plant for the conditions you have, because changing them is almost impossible and very expensive. Because the plants can't tell you what they need, it's up to you to figure it out. I'm lucky in that I find reading plant catalogs and ID books to be lots of fun. But if this isn't the case for you, there are online resources that allow you to look up the plant in question to determine not only which environmental conditions it thrives in, but also what is its native range, whether it's short or long-lived, its bloom season, and how to germinate the seeds. North Carolina Extension Gardener Toolbox is a local resource that also contains ample botanical information. And Prairie Moon is a commercial website that contains lots of information relevant to gardeners, though some information will need to be adjusted for southern climates. A major roadblock to long-term success of native landscaping is not matching the design and plant choice to the maintenance level. In addition to considering environmental conditions, this is also very important. This may seem obvious, but it's often overlooked in the early stages of planning. It's best to plan for the maintenance, skill set, and time you have, not the maintenance levels you wish you had. The garden on the left without irrigation is a garden without irrigation that relies heavily on volunteer labor. The garden on the right is at Mount Cuba Center, the premier native plant display garden on the East Coast that has a full-time trained maintenance staff and access to irrigation. Either can be attractive and wildlife friendly, but it is important to plan accordingly. First, you want to consider the layout of your garden. More complex designs, like the one pictured here, take more skills to maintain. So if you're just starting out, it may be better to start simple. Complicated designs are hard to keep maintained by folks with limited ID skills and or limited time. Choosing easy to identify plants, designing with easy to understand patterns, and the use of strategically placed structural plants will help with weeding, pruning, and other maintenance needs. Simple can be beautiful, and you can always get more complex over time. Keep in mind that anyone maintaining a garden needs to know how to recognize plants when just in their dormant or semi-dormant phase. Flower ID alone won't help with maintenance. Not catching aggressive weeds when they're still easy to remove in the spring is, is a major hurdle in establishing gardens, which means there's a need to be able to identify both weeds and intentional plants in their early stages of growth. When it comes to maintenance needs, not all perennials are created the same. There are several considerations to keep in mind when choosing perennials, and these are especially important for beginner gardeners or where spaces will be maintained by volunteers or anyone without sharp ID skills. The first is whether a perennial is easy to recognize in the spring. This will help for spring weeding and planting so that the wrong plants don't get dug up and you don't have to wait until things are blooming, which is generally later than is helpful, to do your weeding and planting. Penstemon, the plant on the left, has basal foliage that remains evergreen, and the seed heads remain on the plant all winter. The plants on the right, prairie petunia and orange milkweed, are completely dormant and completely invisible underground in the winter. And they're also really late to sprout, usually not emerging until April here on the coast. These should be used strategically in the garden so that they don't get lost. The next consideration is whether a plant is long-lived or short-lived. Long-lived perennials like baptisias, aromatic aster, and Amsonia are great predictable perennials for the garden, though they may take a few years to get to full size. Short-lived perennials need to reseed to remain in the garden, so will move around and are not good choices for foundational plantings. However, they usually grow to maturity in one season, so are great as filler or accent plants where they can be planted close to long-lived perennials and can later seed the space to them as they mature. Short-lived perennials are also good choices for wilder areas where they can be allowed to move around. The last consideration we'll discuss is whether a perennial is clump-forming or spreads through underground roots. Clump-forming perennials are easier to maintain as they will rarely need dividing or need to have their spread controlled from taking over an area. However, there are areas where spreading plants can be an asset and can be utilized for their more aggressive nature. The goal with all of these considerations is to understand the attributes of your plant as being good for some situations and not for others, and not get mad when a plant doesn't do what you want, or, in other words, to try to avoid user error. For plants that will be the foundation of your perennial garden, and especially for gardens with low maintenance levels, it can be smart to depend heavily on species that check all three boxes. Cabbage leaf coneflower, button orangeo, and ironweed are three great choices that are long-lived, clump-forming, and easy to identify year-round. There's no right or wrong to design. Ultimately, it's what makes you happy. But most folks want, or are required to have, a garden that meets at least some of the traditional requirements for landscaping in the US. So once you've thought through the logistics for your space, you can create one that can be easily understood by those viewing it in all seasons of the year. We're just going to go over this briefly because Amy's going to be doing a longer presentation on this very soon. Nature-friendly gardens don't get the benefit of removing everything in the fall when it gets messy to replace with winter annuals, or just featuring plants when they're at their peak, then removing and replacing them. So more thought has to go into how to make them look cared for year-round. We will refer to that as readability, and you can think about it as looking intentional. Elements of design that help create readability are containment, using edges and borders, defining the spaces where the plantings are, layers, using height variation and structural elements, repetition, using the same species or species with similar characteristics in patterns of 3s, 5s, or multiples of 3s and 5s, and succession planting, making sure that there's a species ready to take the space of one that's fading. In coastal North Carolina, we have a long growing season, so this is even more important and more complicated than gardens in the Northeast or Upper Midwest. Another consideration for readability is how folks, including yourself, will interact with your garden. Will it be up close and personal or at 50 miles an hour from a car? Or a little of both, like this garden? The garden in these pictures is at the aquarium on Roanoke Island. and is a main entrance area meant to be welcoming, but mainly seen from cars. It needs to be visually attractive year-round, but with attention-catching plants seasonally, and no plants that have a horribly messy season. So we chose bright colors that can be seen from afar and don't blend together, like yellow baptisia, evergreen plants like yaupons, yucca, and false rosemary, plants with structure and texture, even before they bloom or after the blooms fade, like baptisias, aromatic asters, and perennial grasses. As a side note, this garden also has no irrigation, a small maintenance staff, so the plants have to be both drought tolerant and easy to recognize. Another garden we have on site here is an educational pollinator habitat garden. Hidden away at the back of the property, this garden is meant to invite exploration and discovery of the animals that call it home. In this space, we get the opportunity to use plants that benefit from up-close viewing, that are overlooked from a distance, or that have a longer messy season. As an example, red buckeye loses its leaves in August, giving the appearance to passersby that it's dying, so it isn't a great fit for an entrance sign, but is greatly appreciated here where visitors can get up close and personal with hummingbirds in April. The flowers of Monarda punctata and Allium cernuum are easily overlooked from a distance, but here folks can be awed by the number of pollinators they attract and their intricate flowers. Monarda punctata, or spotted horsemint, also has the habit of jumping around in the garden and flopping over when it gets too tall, especially in fertile soil. So as much as it's one of my favorite flowers, it isn't the best fit for a formal planting. This is not as easy to maintain as a garden, but the plant attributes here are great for a backyard living space or naturalistic meadow garden. Succession planting mimics what happens in any natural meadow. As one perennial fades, others fill the space, and there's never a lot of exposed soil or mulch. Though only 4 months are pictured here, by planting for succession, you can strategically cover up plants that look unkempt when they go dormant or start looking messy during the entire growing season from March to November and into the winter. Unlike New England and the upper Midwest, where a lot of the eco-friendly gardening education materials originate, we in the South don't have the advantage, at least most years, of hiding our messy winter gardens in the snow. Because of this, it's especially important to keep winter in mind when you design. By incorporating plants with persistent seed heads, winter color, and evergreen structure. It shouldn't look like spring in the middle of winter, but many public-facing gardens need to create a sense of intentionality that makes a property look cared for. In these photos, ironweed, aster, and beard tongue seeds, native hollies and blueberries, and perennial grasses keep the garden interesting through the long winter months. As Gloria mentioned, there are many free resources online to get you started with your garden design or amending a current space. Coastal Landscaping Initiative design templates offer many designs for many types of landscapes, from screening off your neighbors to designing a pollinator garden, and there are links in your handout. Wild Ones also has many online designs to choose from, and Homegrown National Park Templates has rollout gardens. There are links to these in the handout, or they can be easily found with a quick Google search. So we're about a third of the way through, so we'll just pause real quick and check in with Christy and see if there are any questions that popped up about plant choices or design concepts before we move on to maintenance.
Hey, Rachel, that was really interesting. I don't see any questions typed out, but if somebody has one and wants to drop it into the questions and answers, we have just a minute for this. And there is a question, talk more about the Monarda. I'm not sure exactly what.
Well, I love it. I don't know that I can talk too much about it now, but it's a native bee balm that really likes low fertility soils and blooms for a really long time. So if you have a space for it, I'd always recommend it. But sometimes it can be a little messy for a commercial or formal garden.
Sure. Thank
But
you.
it's a pollinator favorite, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And then is it a shade plant?
It really prefers at least half or more of a day of sun. Full sun is its preference, I'd say. But it can take a little bit of shade, just gets a little floppier.
Okay, I'm gonna provide one more question. These are getting pretty specific, so I will just do
Okay.
this one more. Somebody is interesting about plants for grass alternatives.
Oh, we're actually going to get to that later in the presentation, so I'll just save that one. So we'll go.
Sounds great. Okay,
Okay.
I think we're good to move on.
Thank you, Christy. Okay, so we will move on to design then. So part 2 is going to be maintenance decision. In the previous presentation, we discussed why these maintenance decisions are important, especially when it comes to inputs like pesticides, which includes both insecticides for killing bugs and herbicides for killing weeds, fertilizers, and irrigation. The majority of this section focuses on how to reduce harmful inputs by eliminating the need for them, and also alternatives to current conventional practices. Much of the science behind nature-friendly maintenance practices includes understanding your inputs and making informed decisions about if and when they're needed. At the end of this section, we'll have a preview of our Shrink Your Lawn presentation and some information on garden cleanup. The labels we put on animals determine how we think about them, but do we really understand their roles in the garden? Are they actually destructive? Are they really dangerous? The common practice is to err on the side of caution, spray first and ask questions later. But here we're going to consider alternatives to this way of thinking about the bugs in our garden. The bugs pictured here include the caterpillar that will transform into the red-spotted purple butterfly, eastern tent caterpillars, a messy caterpillar that's out for a few weeks every spring and provides a buffet for the arrival of spring birds like this black-billed cuckoo, solitary wasps, like the scoliid wasp that provides biological control of Japanese beetles, and flower flies like the Virginia giant hoverfly on the right that act as pollinators and don't bite despite their scary appearance. Insecticide are a type of pesticide that kills insects, and arachnicides are a pesticide that kills mites, spiders, and ticks. Here are just a few available to homeowners. Many of these are broad spectrum, meaning they will kill any invertebrate that they come into contact with that is the same size or smaller than the animal in question. Both can have unintended consequences for non-target wildlife. Currently, insecticides are only tested on European honeybees, a non-native bee species that has a very different life cycle from our native bees. They are not tested on other insects, such as butterflies. In an example of a non-target killing, monarchs were found dead in one of their wintering grounds in California with lethal doses of pyrethroid pesticides. These monarchs' deaths were caused by an unreported or untraceable pesticide application by a nearby local resident or business. Other non-target animals include aquatic invertebrates and fish when pesticides run into waterways. There's really too much to go over in a short presentation, but I would encourage everyone to do your research before using any of these products. Even products like mosquito foggers, which have become increasingly common, carry these risks. In fact, there are many hidden inputs and misunderstood insecticides and arachnicides. Mosquito fogging and sprays are just one example. It's actually much more effective to control mosquito larvae by reducing standing water in your yard, since most mosquitoes don't travel far from where they were born. But we've increasingly relied on municipal and private companies to fog our neighborhoods in an effort to control the adults. In addition, the origin of the product shouldn't be confused with the damage it can do to insect population. Though the term naturally derived often fools consumers into thinking these products are environmentally friendly. Though products such as neonicotinoids, BT, and pyrethrins are naturally derived or organic, they are just as lethal. The neonicotinoids are especially hidden as they are systemic, meaning you can have plants that are treated before you buy them that will still be toxic to your caterpillars. Always ask when buying plants if they have been treated with neonicotinoids. To decide if pest management is needed, you can practice integrated pest management for ornamental horticulture, which is different for IPM for agriculture, but the same premise. We will go through this using some real-life examples. This will take a few minutes, so just bear with me. To begin, you always want to ask yourself, is this plant a good choice for existing environmental conditions? For example, an inkberry holly, which is found in low-lying forests and wetland habitats, is not a great choice for non-irrigated commercial parking lot where it is likely to be stressed. Assuming your plant is well suited to site conditions, you'll want to first identify any bugs you see. We're trained to be terrified of caterpillars and other bugs on our plants, but in nature-friendly gardening, we are choosing specifically to plant the plants to attract caterpillars. Using milkweed as an example, you might notice tiny bugs starting to eat holes in your leaves starting in the spring. But, as you may have guessed, these caterpillars are monarchs, and attracting them is one of the main reasons for planting the milkweeds, so we'll definitely not consider that a pest. You may also have predatory insects, commonly called beneficial bugs or beneficial insects, that can help you control the population of animals that are considered pests. To be considered a true pest in ornamental horticulture, an animal needs to have the capacity to cause irreparable harm to the plant. Insects such as these oleander aphids, an invasive aphid commonly found on milkweeds, could be classified as a pest. Oleander aphids were accidentally introduced to the US from oleander imports. Because milkweeds are closely related to oleander, the aphids are able to use the milkweeds as a host plant, and the milkweeds are not adapted to have any natural defenses for this pest. The good news is, these aphids will not spread to other unrelated plants, so your vegetables and other ornamentals are safe, which is one thing to consider when trying to decide how much damage a pest can do. But now that we've established that the bug in question is a pest, at least on this plant, you can first ask yourself, how badly is the plant being damaged? Plants can tolerate a good amount of herbivory before they are truly damaged by an insect. Oh, those are our oleander aphids, sorry about that. Doug Tallamy, entomologist and founder of Homegrown National Park, suggests following a 10-step plan, taking 10 steps back and see if you still notice the damage. This can help you calmly assess what, if any, actions are needed. Once your pest has been identified, you can look to see if your plant is under any undue stress. Just like animals, plants that are stressed are more susceptible to disease and also insect problems. First-year plants often need more water to establish a supportive root system, so your plant could need supplemental watering. Conversely, plants can become susceptible to pests from having too much nutrient fertility. Over-fertilized plants tend to have more succulent growth than they can support, leaving them defenseless and creating a buffet for insects like plant-sucking aphids. Once you've addressed any visible stressors, you can decide if other actions are warranted. Mechanical removal, using pressurized water or just your hands, is a way to get the pests off your plants and give them a little relief. Just keep in mind that you want to preserve any predatory insects that are also present on your plant. On this milkweed, there's a predatory fly, larva. Though it may be funny looking, it's also eating a lot of aphids, and so removing it will upset the balance of predator and prey, creating more problems in the future. You can also plant flowers with easily accessible nectar to attract predatory flies and support them in their adult stage. Pesticides should be considered a last resort in nature-friendly gardening. If a plant is unhappy enough that it can't withstand pest populations, then it may be time to revisit step one. Is this the right plant for this location? Also keep in mind that any pesticide you use will also affect your beneficial predators and potentially make the problem worse. Most gardeners understand the idea of beneficial insects. These are animals that provide us with biological pest control, pollination, or other garden services. Pictured here are three pretty well-known beneficial predators providing pest control in the garden. If you're a gardener, it's likely you know and recognize these. So I'll just quickly mention that their larval and egg stages are also very important. So we want to make sure we're not unintentionally eradicating them and that we can recognize them. For the ladybugs and lacewings in particular, it's the larval stage that does most of the pest eating, as seen in these pictures. But there are also other insects that are considered beneficial predators that are commonly overlooked or misunderstood, and even eradicated by gardeners. The first one we're going to discuss is the syrphid fly. The tables are stacked against them in terms of lovability. First, because they're flies. Second, many of them are wasp mimics. And third, their larvae have a face only a mother could love. But these insects are doubly beneficial in that they are providing pest control services as larvae or babies and pollination services as adults. There are many species of syrphid flies, In fact, these are just 3 of the 36 species we have documented just on the aquarium grounds. And they all have lovely, intricate patterns when you look closely at them. The fact that they mimic wasps and bees sometimes gets them into trouble, but you can see here by their large eyes that almost touch on the top of their heads, and their short antennae, and the fact they only have 2 wings, that they are indeed flies. Another misunderstood insect group is the solitary wasps. Baby solitary wasps are carnivores, and many of the prey items they feed on are animals humans consider to be pests. The way this works is that the mama wasp lays her egg in an individual nest and then goes out hunting for its host prey item to provision the nest with. When the babies hatch, they will have these prey items to feast on as they grow. Once they grow to be adults, they will only consume nectar, so you may see them visiting and potentially pollinating your flowers. For almost every bug pest you can think of, there is a solitary wasp that uses it as a host animal to feed her young. First is the spider wasp, who hunts black widow spiders to feed her young. Next, we have the Parker's thread-waisted wasp that feeds grasshoppers to her babies. Grasshoppers are one of the worst pests in my ornamental garden, especially for plants in the hibiscus family like okra, so I'm always happy to see these flying around. Another of my favorites is the sand wasp. First, because they're really cool looking with their green eyes, and more importantly, they're predators of biting flies that we here on the coast are so plagued by. The last one pictured is the gold-flecked thread-waist wasp, which can help you control the hornworm or Carolina sphinx moth caterpillars that like to get on tomato plants in the summer. Just to be clear, we're not talking about social wasp here. We're more familiar with social wasps because they tend to make their communal nests on human structures and will also act aggressively to defend those nests. You're probably all familiar with the nest of a paper wasp like the one seen here, or have accidentally disturbed an underground nest of yellow jackets. In reality, less than 2% of wasp species in North America are social, and the other 98.5% are solitary, but they can be easily confused. Solitary wasps do not make communal hives, but as mentioned before, have individual nests like the one on the right, and therefore do not have a hive to guard and are not aggressive. Each mama wasp is responsible for raising her young and provisions her baby's brood cell with specific prey items depending on the wasp species. Most people tend to be scared of wasps because they've had bad experiences with social wasps, such as yellow jackets and paper wasps, as I know I have. Though they may look similar, solitary wasps use their stinger to subdue prey, not for being aggressively territorial. Also, solitary wasps are vegetarians as adults, so are not the wasps that will harass you at a barbecue, unlike our yellow jacket species that are all too happy to get a taste of your picnic. Social wasps, while generally docile when they're away from their nest, are less desirable if they've built a nest near one's home or workspace, where they may feel the need to guard it and should usually be eradicated if they're in a dangerous location. To close our discussion of beneficial insects in the garden, we'll briefly mention our native bees. Though not providing biological control of pests, these are the most effective pollinators of native plants, and most of the plants in our vegetable gardens, and contain a number of host specialist bees. Because 75% of native bees create individual nests in the ground, they are often confused with ground wasps or yellow jackets. Though solitary bee moms will often share the same entrance hole, as seen on the right, or nest nearby each other at suitable nesting sites, each mom makes her own individual nest and is responsible for stocking it with enough food in the form of nectar and pollen for her developing babies. She has no incentive to put herself in harm's way or guard her nest site, so will not act aggressively. The males of many species don't even have stingers, and others are so small the stingers can't penetrate human skin. There are close to 3,000 species of ground nesting bees in the US, and though they may look threatening when they buzz around near the ground looking for entry to their holes, they should never be considered a pest. But in fact, when you search ground nesting bee on the internet, these are sadly the first results you get. So I want to spread the word that instead of killing, we should be celebrating these important pollinators. There seems to be more information out there on stem nesting bees, but I want to mention them just in case it's a new concept for you. About 30% of native bee species are stem nesters, like this leafcutter bee. These are also solitary and do not have a communal hive to guard. As a side note, it's fascinating to watch them make their nest, as I got to do with this leafcutter bee who was using a hollow stem of chicory from my vegetable garden last summer. She backed into the stem to lay her egg, then spent some time stocking it with pollen and nectar for her baby to feed on over the winter, then sealed it off with this bit of leaf she'd cut from a nearby plant. After that, her life cycle was complete. Hopefully, this spring the baby will emerge and start a new nest somewhere else in the yard. You may also have seen these bee nesting blocks, sometimes confusingly called bee hotels. Stem nesting bees can generally find their own hollow spaces to nest, but these can be used for educational purposes or just so you can enjoy watching them, since in the garden the bees can be hard to find. However, though there are many holes, these are still not hives or communal spaces, and solitary bees do not guard their nests the way European honeybees, a communal species, do. It would obviously be a lot to ask someone to learn the thousands of insect species that exist in your area, but you don't have to know all your insects. Free resources are available. iNaturalist is a great resource that I mentioned earlier for plant ID. It can be used to identify any form of life and is especially useful for insects. You don't have to have any information, just a photo with your phone. Your smartphone, that is. Once you share the picture, there are many insect specialists that will help you identify your photos. As a bonus, the information you share will be contributing to community science, where there is a dearth of insect information as compared to other species. Appreciating the insects that your garden attracts also adds an entire extra level of enjoyment to your yard and outdoor spaces, as it has for these community science volunteers here at the aquarium. Okay, we're going to take a quick pause here to check with Christy and see if there are any questions on insects or insecticides before we move on to our other inputs.
Yeah, I know. I learned a lot about our allies. So we have a question about mosquito dunks. What do you think about mosquito dunks and mosquito dunk buckets?
Yeah, I know they can be really effective. I know that's very recommended to do. I mean, I try my best just to remove all standing water so that they don't have a place to breed. But I know they're often used as a place to sort of concentrate the mosquitoes so that they can be eradicated. You know, I don't know which is more effective, just trying to reduce the amount of standing water or trying to sort of like trap them in there. I would have to defer to someone else to see but either of those is going to be more effective than trying to address the adults, and is not going to affect all the other insects in your yard the way the fogging will.
Right. Okay, thanks. Two more questions. What do you think about fungicides? Somebody mentioned in particular their Monarda struggled with fungus.
Oh, probably with the powdery mildew. I mean, powdery mildew, we obviously live in the South. It's really humid here. Usually by the end of the season, your plants are going to get some powdery mildew. I usually just try to live with it. Bee balms in particular are very susceptible to powdery mildew. I have noticed the more stressed out the plant is, the more powdery mildew it tends to get. So if it's not in a happy place, but I definitely, it would be different in agriculture to have a discussion about it. But with ornamental stuff, it's really just affecting the look of it. And if it's so bad that it's destroying the plant's probably not happy where it is. But yeah, I definitely don't use fungicides. They're pretty.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Just pick a different plant.
Yeah, and then one really great last question. Somebody thanks you for the wasp and bee info and wonders where they can learn more.
Oh, there's a couple of places. One place I really recommend is the Ohio State University has done several, they're called like pollinator workshops. They have a different name that's more catchy. But basically, if you go to their website, you can search for the webinars, and they've recorded kind of experts in the field. So people like Heather Holm and other like pollinator research folks who, that's what they do all day. And they've recorded some really good webinars on beneficial wasps, different native bees, bumblebees, flies. So you can find almost any insect you want. And yeah, I love watching those. And there's many of them to choose from.
Great, thanks. You can move on now.
Okay, thank you, Christy. Okay, so we're going to keep talking about our inputs, sadly moving away from insects, which I like talking about. So other harmful inputs used for maintaining our outdoor spaces Our next topic is going to be herbicides. Herbicides are pesticides that are used to kill unwanted vegetation, so are used for weeding as opposed to mechanical means, or in other words, using chemicals instead of your hands to get rid of plants that you don't want to be there. Herbicides have become much more user-friendly in the past 20 years and are frequently used to control unwanted plants in ornamental spaces, especially in our lawns. In addition, there are many herbicides that are hidden in places where consumers may not be aware that they're applying them. Mulches and fertilizers, especially lawn fertilizers, often contain herbicides, so make sure you look closely at the label if this is not something you're looking for. Though there are application instructions on herbicides, herbicide use and disposal is generally unregulated for homeowners. A common side effect from herbicide use is drift that kills or damages non-target plants, such as the tomato pictured here. This has become more common as the systemic herbicide 2,4-D has increased its market share because of the growing lack of efficacy of Roundup. This herbicide volatilizes and can drift into neighboring yards or natural areas, especially if the instructions are not carefully followed. Another side effect is intentionally killing off potential host and nectar plants that may be present in your lawn, such as the violets growing here that act as a host plant for this Gulf fritillary, and nectar for bees and butterflies. So what are other strategies to control unwanted vegetation in your garden, which will always be an issue? My best suggestion is to catch them early. We all know the feeling of being overwhelmed with weeds in July, when it's too hot to want to address them, as opposed to March, April, and May, when there are many lovely weather days and the weeds are still small enough to remove by hand, versus needing a more aggressive tool. The gardens here at work have lots of weed pressure from nearby invasive plants, and if I wait for the Clematis ternifolia or thorny olives to establish roots, I'll be using a pickaxe or shovel instead of gently pulling them up in a way that I find most satisfying, knowing the damage they would have caused if I'd left them there. I encourage everyone to spend some therapeutic weeding time in your gardens this time of year, and just be sure not to dig up any of the plants you planted, and look closely for any reseeding perennials that are desirable. Next is selecting appropriate tools for the weeds you're addressing. There are lots of options, and working smarter, not harder, can save you lots of time and backache. Another strategy harkens back to design, which is leaving less space between plants. Exposed soil creates space that weed seeds can easily germinate. Along those same lines, using preventative mulch in appropriate quantities can reduce the amount of exposed soil. We're talking here just about a couple of inches, not enough to bury the crowns of the plants. When applied appropriately, mulches can be especially useful in gardens like this that are weeded infrequently due to lack of time or staff. However, most herbicides in the US are used on lawns to control plants commingling with the turf. Each spring, you'll see lots of these blue-green patterns on lawns that have been treated with pesticides to control a variety of plants that are considered undesirable. Personally, this always confuses me a little, since I feel like the only reason I'd have a lawn is to be able to walk on it, or have my pets or kids walk on it, and spraying it renders it unsafe for walking. What we're recommending here is a change of mindset about your lawn. For areas where lawns are needed, think if it can be walked on and mowed, and it isn't invasive in your area, you can just let it be. I like to think of these as walkable weeds. White clover is a non-native but non-invasive plant that can commingle with the turf, greens up before the grasses in the spring, and is velvety soft to walk on. Beyond that, it provides resources for pollinators like this leafcutter bee and eastern tail blue butterfly. Some other walkable weeds that you will see this time of year in the late winter and early spring are the low-growing winter annuals. Some, like this henbit, are not native, and others, like the field pansy, are. Their life cycle is similar to that of ornamental pansies in the South. They germinate in the fall, grow all winter, and do their really showy blooming, if you get real close to them, in February and May, and then their life cycle's over, and they'll die when the temperatures heat up. As long as they're not invasive, they can be left to provide early season nectar sources for hungry early season pollinators. In fact, using herbicides on these is just kind of a waste of time and money, as they'll soon disappear on their own. Pictured on the right are early emerging blueberry bees, calligrapher flies, and a queen bumblebee that I photographed here on the first week of March using the flowers in our lawn when nothing else was blooming. As a side note, I would also suggest delayed mowing or no-mow March so they can use these resources while they wait for more nectar availability in April. Lastly, here are just a few of our native lawn weeds that don't compete with grass, but are often eradicated. Many of these, like the Wright's plantain, which is a host plant for buckeye butterflies, will go dormant after blooming. Others, like the diminutive Helen's flower, can be mowed all summer and will continue blooming and supporting pollinators like this leafcutter bee. Toadflax resembles a snapdragon when viewed up close and blooms just in time for the emergence of crystal skippers in our Crystal Coast counties. Lyre-leaf sage is one of my favorites, a ground-hugging plant with burgundy variegated leaves that resembles a juga in the winter, but that sends up a much showier blue salvia flower that's visited by hummingbirds in April before it essentially goes dormant for the summer. There are more walkable weeds than I'm able to cover here, so I'll mention again that iNaturalist is a great way to identify unknown plants in your lawn. I'll also reiterate that the most nature-friendly strategy is to reduce your lawn size where lawns aren't needed. But where they are needed, I hope you'll consider walkable weeds as an effective herbicide reduction strategy. Moving on to fertilizer. As we discussed in January, both the production and use of synthetic fertilizers can have harmful environmental impacts. But before we move on, a quick review of what the fertilizer label means. All fertilizers must display the percentages of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium on the label. It's best to look for NPK values in the single digits. Higher values can cause the type of succulent growth that attracts insect pests such as aphids. In addition, these nutrients are not held in our sandy soils, and nutrients not taken up by the plants will run off into local waterways or into groundwater, where they can cause eutrophication or other forms of nutrient pollution. It's also important to note that fertilizers are often pre-mixed into horticultural products, such as potting soils. Sterile potting soil is available, allowing you to choose your own type and amount of fertilizer, but can be harder to find. Organic potting soils usually have the more reasonable NPK percentages and are derived from natural instead of synthetic sources. But instead of relying on synthetic fertilizers for your garden, you can use compost or one of the many organic fertilizers available. Also, the right plant, right place concept, which we've discussed ad nauseum, will help you reduce your reliance on inputs. Some plants are considered heavy feeders, while others thrive in nutrient-poor soils. This is true of many of our native plants, especially those native to sandy, low-nutrient habitats. Some examples are nitrogen-fixing plants, such as wax myrtles, and plants in the pea family, like baptisias and partridge peas. The soil pictured here on the right is mainly what's considered urban soil. It's not high in nutrients, but with just a light application of compost before planting, we're able to support a variety of native plants throughout the growing season. In the picture on the left, Eleanor seems to be enjoying herself here watering her artichokes. But when July hits in North Carolina, I don't have much interest in spending more time outside with a watering can or a hose. It's unlikely that you can prevent all watering, but you can make it more manageable, save yourself money, and protect groundwater resources by taking advantage of the water available to you and reducing the need for it elsewhere. The first strategy is to go where the water is. This goes back to design. Place your garden in an area where the water needs are lower and utilize the water from your roof and other impermeable surfaces by utilizing rain barrels or funneling the water straight into your gardens, which will also help with stormwater management, as is seen in this road median at Arlington Cemetery. Use slope and low spots to your advantage and utilize more drought-resistant plants where water availability is low. Planting at the appropriate time of year can also reduce your need for irrigation, as it will allow the plant to develop the type of root system it needs before it has to survive a North Carolina summer. Appropriate planting times for coastal North Carolina are dependent on the type of plant you have. Trees and shrubs are best planted in late fall through the end of winter, and flowering perennials are best in the fall, but can also be planted in early spring. Just try to be done by the beginning of May if possible. Warm season grasses and perennials that are marginally hardy are better in spring or early fall when the ground is still warm. Reducing exposed soil to prevent evaporation is another strategy. There are a few ways to do this. One is using appropriate spacing between plants. For some reason, we've become convinced that plants should not touch, or worse, that we need to see the mulch around each plant. By mimicking what happens in nature, we don't want to crowd our plants, but we do want to be okay with them being close enough to one another so that the ground isn't completely exposed. Succession planting, which we mentioned earlier, will help with this since newly emerging plants will take the place of those that fade. In the top picture, aromatic aster leaves have just begun to grow tall in late April and will soon cover up the fading and somewhat unsightly leaves of spiderworts that are soon to be done blooming. In the bottom picture, these are joined by fall blooming grasses and ironweed. When establishing new plantings, there will often be lots of space between plants that will fill in as those plants mature. You can consider using filler plants, like those short-lived perennials mentioned earlier, or annuals that will die back at the end of the season. They can make the garden look fuller and their life cycles will be ending when the more long-lived plants have grown to maturity. As opposed to the bed on the left, the bed on the right used Helen's flower and blanket flowers to fill in the spaces between young aromatic asters. And this space was later seeded to the asters when they bloomed in October. Another option that can be used in conjunction with these strategies are organic mulches. In addition to reducing water needs, they can be used to suppress undesirable plants and add nutrients to your soils as they decompose. Materials used depend on resources you have and your site. I love using compost when I have enough, and also collect the deciduous southern red oak leaves from my neighbor's yard for my shrub and veggie gardens, since he's going to throw them away anyway. Even live oak leaves can be a good mulch, though they break down more slowly than deciduous leaves. To close our discussion of inputs, let's look at these two examples of newly planted gardens in the front yards of two houses. The garden on the left uses appropriate spacing to reduce weed pressure and conserve soil moisture. It employs successional planting. The spring phlox blooming in this picture will soon seed to fall blooming grasses and asters. There are several plants that will provide winter interest, and a light organic mulch was used to suppress weeds as the plants establish in their first year. The garden on the right has the plants spaced very far apart and doesn't use any successional planting, filler plants, or organic mulches. There is some winter interest with grasses and evergreens, but the space is dominated by a rock mulch over landscape fabric, taking away any space for overwintering insects and creating the need to use herbicides for weeding, as unwanted plants are impossible to remove by hand from landscape fabric and rocks. To summarize, using consideration in your design decisions and plant choices will help reduce the need for inputs, create aesthetically pleasing spaces, and benefit wildlife. But always keep in mind when you're making any garden decisions that perfection is the enemy of good, and the goal here is to know better so we can do better. Another way to reduce the need for harmful inputs in your yard that I'll only touch on briefly is reduce turf area where not needed, or reducing the size of your lawn. There are obviously areas where a lawn is needed to fulfill the purposes of the space. Golf courses, soccer fields, playgrounds, and even spaces in your yard for kids and pets to play. The idea is to question whether the lawn is the best fit for the space, and if so, trying to make it as nature-friendly as possible. But when lawns aren't needed to fill the entire space, other options can be used to achieve the uniformity and straightforward maintenance that lawns offer. In the house on the right, a homeowner allows a natural beach meadow to thrive and reduces the need for mowing, herbicides, or irrigation. Plants like Monarda punctata, little bluestem, seaside goldenrod, and blanket flowers mingle with other beach grasses that don't get tall enough to block the house, but provide more straightforward maintenance in an area that doesn't really get much foot traffic. Try to identify areas where lawns aren't being used. Parking lot medians are a great example of a place that doesn't get a lot of foot traffic and can be modified to contain native plantings, like these in Arlington Cemetery. For areas where you might want to eliminate turf, but still want to have straightforward maintenance needs lower than that of a perennial garden, and would like it to take light foot traffic, there are many options even in coastal soils. One of my favorites is grass leaf aster, also known as silky aster. It has the appearance of grass and can be interplanted with perennials, as seen here with the seaside goldenrod, if desired. It also has lovely yellow flowers in the late fall that attract skippers and other butterflies. It can be mowed or tidied up if needed, but generally only needs that about once a year. Other lawn alternatives that can be considered walkable ground covers that can take mowing are frog fruit, partridge berry, and for areas that don't get any foot traffic, evergreen Carolina jessamine is an option for lawn replacement. These are just a few ideas, and I encourage you to be creative. Replacing your lawn doesn't have to mean installing a high-maintenance garden. You can maintain a uniform and easy-to-care-for area that's also eco-friendly. For more on this topic, check back later this summer for our Shrink Your Lawn presentation. To close, we'll discuss tidying up. First, let's consider why we tidy up. Fall and winter cleanup is a practice that's widely accepted. So we need to ask ourselves, is there a reason for this from a plant health perspective? The answer is no. In the wild, the old growth of these plant materials will break down naturally while providing habitat and release nutrients into the soil. But for our aesthetic and weeding purposes, sometimes tidying up is necessary. As an example, for the gardens here at work, I need to reduce the amount of last year's plant material in the garden so that I can see the weeds, which include pine seedlings from the densely planted nearby loblollies, invasive clematis ternifolia, and thorny olive seedlings deposited by birds before they get too big to remove. If I let these plants take root for more than one season, they could become unmanageable. But the main reason for tidying is done in ornamental settings is aesthetic, so that the new growth is not obscured by last year's stems and leaves. If it's deemed necessary, we can endeavor to tidy up in the most nature-friendly way by having an awareness of the animals that you've attracted to your space and how they might be using that habitat you've created. This was mentioned earlier, so just a reminder that choosing plants for winter interest in the design phase will help give your winter garden a more intentional, cared-for look that will help you control the urge to tidy up in the fall. Little blue stems, mountain mints, and other plants pictured here provide a variety of shapes and textures for the winter garden. I also encourage you to rethink your relationship with dormant season gardens. We are trained to see dormancy as a type of death instead of a resting period that allows us to appreciate the rebirth and new growth in springtime. I'll be the first to admit that I didn't always see the aesthetic appeal of the winter garden, but once you see it and realize all the life it sustains, you can't unsee it. Your winter garden is a habitat just as much as the garden is in summer. All the animals that are attracted to your space will need a place to overwinter, and the ones pictured here, a leafcutter bee and its nest, an orb weaver and her egg sac, a black swallowtail and an overwintering chrysalis attached to a stem, and a polyphemus moth that wraps its cocoons in leaves, which often fall to the ground in the winter. These are just a few of the creatures I found during my spring tidy up over the years. In addition to our insect friends, winter seed heads also provide food for adult birds in the lean winter months and nesting material in the spring. So on to the logistics, how and when to tidy up. Once you've decided you need to do it with consideration. For coastal North Carolina, mid to late March is a good time to start this process, and you can look for weeds while you work. Be gentle and deliberate when you remove things, and try to find a place for last year's plant material where it can break down naturally and the insects can emerge, preferably near your garden. Sometimes I like to take the stems of things like ironweeds and button oranjo and stick them in the garden a little farther out of sight where they can remain but be covered by new growth by mid-April. If your garden's big enough, you can create small brush piles or scatter them loosely as mulch. You'll be surprised at how quickly they break down. Also, keep an eye out for overwintering creatures so you can find a place to put them in their garden if they haven't yet emerged. Whatever you decide to do, just make sure last year's plant growth goes somewhere the animals can emerge in the spring. If you're completely without options, municipal composting is always a better option than plastic bags going to the landfill. But do your best to find a place that they can break down naturally. When cutting your hollow stem plants or pithy shrubs, leave enough stem for stem nesting bees to use them for the upcoming season's nest. Many stems are not persistent, meaning they will have already broken down over the winter, and others are so thin or wiry they are unlikely to be used. But for plants like ironweeds, joe pies, bonesets, and the many other hollowed stem perennials, creating open spaces for stem nesting is usually done in the spring, though this can vary based on the bloom season of the plant in question. Leave 8 or more inches of the plant for this purpose, as seen here. The leafcutter bee that was pictured in the previous slides used the stem of a winter hardy chicory in my vegetable garden. This stem was cut back in early June once the plant had died, and was used sometime in July to create the nest. Waiting till the following spring to cut back that particular plant, which was necessary for space constraints, wouldn't have made any sense. So there is some need to rely on your common sense to tell you when the best time to cut back is. Though late winter, early spring is the answer for most of your flowering perennials to get the best combination of preserving overwintering habitat for all insects and creating nesting space for bees. You may have heard the catchphrases, leave the leaves, leaves aren't litter, or soft landings. These are popular ways to get us to rethink our relationship with leaves. This doesn't mean there won't be some situations that leaves won't need to be thinned or relocated, but that we should preserve all that we can as overwintering habitat for many of our pollinators, and that mowing leaves or blocking access to ground habitats or landscape fabric isn't recommended for nature-friendly spaces, as it destroys or blocks overwintering habitat. There are a variety of ways you can conserve leaf habitat, and yet every fall and winter we send Luna moths, hair streak butterflies, and lightning bugs to the landfill because we see the leaves as trash. The bottom line is try your best not to throw away or block access to the leaves that insects need to overwinter, since these are just a few of the many native insects that use that habitat. There's lots of information available to gardeners wanting to make their spaces more eco-friendly these days. It's always daunting to me to figure out how to pull it all together and best synthesize it for folks who aren't full-time gardeners. So here is a summary of all we've covered in these two presentations on nature-friendly gardening. Nature-friendly gardens and landscapes don't have to look wild and unkempt. They can if that's what you wish, but they don't have to. Preserve what you can and add native plants, prioritizing keystones. Show consideration for how inputs like insecticides, herbicides, irrigation, and synthetic fertilizers are used on your property. Take the time to understand the wildlife that are using your garden and how your cleanup practices may affect them. And lastly, I always want to end by saying that your actions can make a difference. We often think about our yard as just being one space, but unlike a lot of environmental conservation actions, this is a really fun action we can take. And like this house on the left, each of these spaces used to be a habitat. When I first moved into my neighborhood, both of these houses were wooded lots. So, whoever is going to buy that house has an opportunity to do something with it. Also, all our houses are connected to the natural areas and waterways that surround us, as seen as the picture on the right. But if even some of these yards started implementing nature-friendly practices, it would create a continuum of habitat that would be a huge benefit to our wildlife and the surrounding ecosystems. So to close, I want to end with an experience that I had last fall that illustrates the concept, if you build it, they will come. I was helping a friend plant some asters in her garden. As we went in for lunch, not 10 minutes after the asters had been planted, a pearl crescent butterfly, who uses aster as her host plant, landed on the newly planted aster and laid eggs on the leaf. And here she is doing that right there. These butterflies overwinter as caterpillars. So you may see them in the spring when you're doing your careful and deliberate spring cleanup, which reinforces the just as important, but not nearly as catchy. If you manage for long-term survival, they will stay. And you'll see next year's adults emerging just as the blueberries are blooming in April. So that's all I have on nature-friendly gardening, but Gloria has put together for us a list of upcoming plant sales, since that's always one of the biggest questions we get, and also a link to a list of nurseries in North Carolina that offer native plants. And lastly, our contact information should you need it. And then from there, I'll leave that up for a minute and then I'll switch slides, but I'm going to turn it back over to Christy. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. That was so interesting. Before I get to some of the questions, we have about 6 minutes for questions left. I do want to point out that there will be an evaluation survey link put in the chat. Gloria is going to put that in the chat. So before you leave, if you could grab that link, we would really appreciate it because we like hearing your feedback. Okay, so I'm going to start with some of the general questions to get to those first. The idea of no mow March, is that late enough to holding off mowing till the end of March, or is there some other better practice there?
Well, let me think of an easy way to answer. So that Nomo May, which most people have heard of, actually started in England, and they have a very different climate than we do. So, depending on what, and the US is a much, much bigger area. So depending on what part of the state and what part of the country you live in, it's, March for us is the time here. At least I'm in the Northeast too, so it might be a little different down in Onslow County, but that's the time for us where there's just very little blooming. Like the serviceberry are barely starting. There's a few yellow jasmine just starting now, but at the beginning of March, there's almost nothing blooming. And also by the time you get to the end of March, it's hard if you have a lawn, especially if you're, you have restrictions or in a commercial area, you can't go too long without mowing before people start to get aggravated with you. So that's my recommendation specifically for Dare County and the Northeast Coast is if you can make it through March, there'll be more things blooming and they won't be dependent on those lawn weeds anymore. But right now, that's where almost all, well, at least 2 weeks ago, that's where almost all of our pollinators were on the lawn. So,
Awesome. Thank you.
I'm going to end the slideshow real quick so y'all can see the
great.
people. Okay.
Okay, so there's a question on how to identify keystone plants. And are you able to name a few off the top of your head for coastal North Carolina?
Sure. Well, first, I would definitely refer you to both the Homegrown National Park and National Wildlife Federation websites. If you go to those, you can just type in your zip code and it will give you a list. The easiest thing to say is that oaks and asters are your like top plants. And then cherries, willows are big ones. I also, if you're more curious and you haven't seen the first presentation, we did talk about it for a long time. So I know that recording's out there if you want to watch that. But yeah, anything in the aster family, if you're talking about perennials, are going to be a keystone, and oaks are the best keystone, the most productive, I guess, keystone for us on the coast here, yeah. And most of the East Coast.
Great, thank you. There was a question earlier that I think Emily answered, but just in case you wanted to elaborate, somebody was asking about using the pine straw from their pine trees. Is there mulch, and is it as beneficial as the leaves? What are your thoughts on pine straw?
Yeah, I definitely use it. I mean, I encourage everyone to use what you have available. We have tons of pines on the property here, so I definitely use it, especially for shrub and, those sort of landscape beds where there's not as many small perennials. They are going to break down a lot slower than deciduous leaves. I don't know if I could compare it to live oak leaves, but I mean, most people in North Carolina know what pine straw feels like. It's not going to be gone next year. And, it seems like when I was growing up, it was like, oh, it's going to acidify your soil. And it seems like there's like emerging research that maybe that's not a huge deal. Also, most of our shrubs like acidic soil, so I don't know that that's a big deal. I definitely recommend it, especially as opposed to carting it off to the landfill or whatever else people do with it. It's there, it's a natural mulch. But in some of your perennial beds, it might sometimes be so thick that, when new stuff is coming up, it sort of suppresses it. So, yeah. Thumbs up.
Okay, we just have a couple more. There was one that popped up in the chat that I'm going to bring up. Somebody was asking about what about when squirrels and deer eat your plants? And I think I know how you're going to answer it, but go ahead.
Yeah, we're kind of lucky here in Manio in that we're on a little island without deer, because I know most of my neighbors on the beaches have major issues with deer. I mean, deer are really overpopulated, so it's a hard thing to address. Like you're not going to like reduce the deer population. There are plants that deer are less likely to eat, and I would say like if your deer pressure is really heavy, trying to focus more on those plants. Like I have friends in Southern Shores where most of the deer seem to live on the Outer Banks, and what they do is they have one area of their yard fenced in of plants that they really want to have them, but they know they have so many deer they could never grow them outside the fence. And then they focus those plants in there, their blueberries and some of the perennials they really like, and then they have the rest of the plants outside. Not everyone's yard is going to be compatible with that, but yeah, I would just say, trying to focus on for us here on the Roanoke Island, because we don't have any predators, we have people always laugh at this, but the bunny problem is like out of control. Like there are a number of plants I just had to stop growing completely because as soon as they grow, the bunnies just it's like they just basically can't grow. But I have been able to find enough plants that the bunnies won't eat that you can still have a thriving garden. You just might not get to plant a few things that you're really fond of.
Yeah, I hear that echinacea does not survive on my property.
So
Um,
here either.
let's get to what we're kind of at our closing time. There was a question about how to convert lawn to meadow, but it sounds like that will be covered probably in an upcoming, what's the name of that webinar?
Shrink Your Lawn is happening
Shrink Your
this summer. Yeah,
Lawn.
it's kind of a bigger
Love
question.
it.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. So there's probably 3 questions left that we can, I guess, answer when we send out an email. Is that how we're doing that, Gloria?
Yes, we will do that. I'm answering now. There was a question about that last aster that was mentioned. Was it aromatic aster? I'm not sure.
Probably. I talk about that one a lot, so it's very likely.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, yeah, we're coming to the close here. So thank you, everybody. If you did not grab the evaluation form in the chat, please do so. I'm going to drop it one more time. We'd love to hear your feedback for future webinars. Thanks, Rachel. That was awesome.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks. Wonderful.